Hi there and welcome back. I hope you're doing well wherever you are, and I hope you had a chance to view the welcome video that explained our procedures for how we're going to do this remote learning. If you haven't had a chance to do that, watch that first. This will make more sense. This is our first content video of the rest of the semester, and it is on environmental justice. So a recap of where we've been in this course and where we're going from here. If you recall, a long time ago, our first section was about ways of thinking about environmentalism and the individual, society, non-human triangle, and a little bit of environmental philosophy. And then we kind of went into some of the major concerns and themes of the environmental revolution of the 1960s and 70s. Those were things like human population growth and demography, resource depletion, environmental pollution, health and risk, and then biodiversity decline just as we were getting to spring break and all the craziness began. We were talking about ecosystem services and things like ecosystem stress and so on. We have one more topic in that section, and that's what we're going to talk about this week, disparity and environmental justice, also a theme from the 1960s and 70s that's still with us today. Just so you know, the rest of the class is going to be, after this week, looking at some positive aspects of this, environmental remediation and action, how we try to remedy some of these problems that we have, and in some ways how we've been successful, and in some ways how we haven't been successful. Okay, so let's talk about environmental justice. So first of all, I want to give thanks to Chelsea Romulo of the University of Northern Colorado. I'm borrowing several of her ideas of how to do this online, so thanks to her. First of all, the basic concept is something that you probably are familiar with already. This is the idea that some people experience better environmental circumstances than others. That's the simplest way to say it. And that can be for any number of reasons, and it can be in a lot of different sort of situations. It can involve environmental goods or environmental bads, but it just means that some people disproportionately are getting the short end of the stick. What this does is it shifts the focus that we've been talking about of things like what, where, and how much, like environmental pollution or biodiversity decline or exposure or risk. It shifts those questions to who is affected most by these things. So here is a definition of environmental injustice. A group bears a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, municipal, or commercial operations or the execution of federal, state, local, and tribal programs and policies. That's a very government type definition, and it comes from the US EPA. But in red is highlighted the important part of that, I think. A disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences are borne by one group or one type of people. What is meant by a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences? Well, generally it means three things. One group is exposed to a community problem that they did not generate themselves. In other words, this is not a problem that they caused. The exposed community receives marginal benefits. Maybe they are receiving some benefits, like from a power plant, for example, but the harms are way outweighing those marginal benefits. The benefits are small in comparison. And others are receiving the benefits without the harms. Finally, the exposed community bears the environmental burden. So whatever environmental bads are coming from this action, it is borne by one group of people more than others. Here's a quick example. This is a place in California called Kettleman City. It is a community that is about 95% Hispanic, and it is mostly Spanish speaking. Mostly fairly blue collar or low income type jobs. And you can see on this map right next to it, right along I-5 there in California, there is a chemical waste plant that has a hazardous waste incinerator. A hazardous waste incinerator is a place that burns wastes that are considered carcinogens to dispose of them and ends up sending a lot of that waste into the atmosphere to be breathed by people that are downwind from it. So you can imagine in Kettleman City here, there's a protester here in the picture in the upper right, that they're not very happy about this and are saying that this would not have occurred in a wealthy community. This is a community that does not have often the power to fight back against things like this. And so in some ways, they're bearing a disproportionate share of the burden here, because a lot of that air pollution from that hazardous waste incinerator is going to be affecting their town, and maybe not the wealthy town down the road. So that's one of many examples of environmental injustice. Okay, so based on the reading that you did for the way, and by the way, you did not have any question or comment due for the readings this week. We'll start that again next week. But if you read the article in the book on the theories of environmental justice, here are some concepts that you are probably familiar with. First of all is what's called the distributive theory. Very simply, what we've been talking about, that good and bad things should be equally distributed for there to be justice, so that people should have equal access to good, and nobody should bear undue burden of the bad things. Recognition theory. This is the idea of justice, that some groups or communities can just not be recognized for others, because in a sense be invisible, and that is a form of disrespect, and that lack of recognition sort of paves the way for one group to dominate another, what's known as social domination. And of course you see this in a lot of aspects of environmental justice. Participation theory. Who gets to participate in the decision making? So for there to be justice, the idea is that no group should go unheard, right? Any group should have and must have input to all decisions. So another way of saying this is true justice would seek the input of all constituents with equal voice. And of course, that doesn't often happen in a lot of situations of environmental injustice. This one's called capability theory, and this is the idea that real justice should result in communities being capable and have well-being, and have the capability to function. And if that is lacking or their well-being is affected, then there is injustice. So all of these are kind of social science ideas of what do we mean by justice, and a lot of these are being violated when we talk about environmental injustice. So I want to connect this to the 1960s and 70s to show you kind of where this came from. Of course, we've talked a lot about how that era was really the environmental revolution in this country and around the world. It was also the civil rights era in the United States, and we'll connect those two in a minute. So I can't really tell you that the Civil Rights Act of 1974 addressed environmental justice. We'll look in a few minutes at how it sort of did. But there were a lot of bubbling examples of not only human rights, but environmental rights. Just a few quick examples. So in the 1960s, Latino farm workers were protesting and fighting for human rights for the farms they were working on. They were being exposed to a lot of carcinogenic chemicals, some of the chemicals that we've learned about in the past few weeks. They were being exposed to without much protection. And their leader, Cesar Chavez, led protests on getting human rights, but also those were environmental rights. In 1967 in Houston, there were big protests for a garbage dump that was being proposed in a community that was largely poor and largely African American. You'll learn more about that in a minute or two. In Harlem in 1968, there were similar protests on the placement of a sewage treatment plant that was being placed in a poor community. And then a lot of data in the 1970s started to come out on documentation of where landfills and hazardous waste dumps and so on were being located. And pretty clearly, they were disproportionately being located in low-income, often minority communities. This one in particular, the garbage dump in Houston, was a kind of a spark point for the environmental justice movement in some ways. And I want you to learn a little bit more about that. So Dr. Robert Bullard, sometimes called the father of environmental justice, has had a career at Texas Southern University and has done a lot of work and written a lot of articles and books and spoken all over the world about this thing. He has an interview that's on a YouTube page here that I would like you to watch. It's about 15 minutes long, and he talks a lot about this early work that he did in Houston, recognizing where these injustices were happening and helping people to protest this. So I don't think you can click on this from the YouTube video that I am making, but I'm going to post a separate document that gives you the link to this. So one of your assignments is to watch this interview with Robert Bullard on civil rights and environmental justice. The second thing I'd like you to do, is read about this place called Warren County, North Carolina, sometimes called the birthplace of environmental justice. And I'll let you read about it. There was a little bit in the chapter that you read for this week. Read a little bit more, and I'll give you this link as well. This is a short web page that sort of summarizes what went on in Warren County, North Carolina, and why this is considered the birthplace of environmental justice. So I will post those two links on a separate document on NOPL. Okay, so I mentioned the Civil Rights Act of 1964 didn't exactly address environmental justice, but it sort of laid the groundwork for the idea that it should be addressed. So this Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination by race, color, or national origin by any entity or program that receives federal funds. So basically it was saying any action that receives federal funds or is done by a federal agency can't discriminate on those grounds. So in the green text there, you could say under the Civil Rights Act, marginalized groups should be protected from environmental injustice. And the little circles here are showing you how these two things should coincide. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 should dovetail with environmental injustice. It hasn't always, but in theory it should. Really until 1994, this was not specifically enforced. And that's a long time. So 30 years from the passage of the Civil Rights Act until 1994, an executive order signed by President Clinton that required all federal agencies to make achieving environmental justice part of its mission. In other words, to write this into the rules for any federal agency. But that tells you how long it took for civil rights issues to recognize that environmental justice should be part of those. So one question that sometimes people have is, are cases of environmental injustice always racially motivated? In other words, are they nefarious schemes to dump or drill or mine or put pollution or extract materials in areas that are poor or minority? And I think the answer to that is not always, and maybe not really frequently. So here's how a lot of times this happens. As you know, we live in a world that is largely segregated by race and ethnicity and income. Wealthier communities often have a better ability to influence political action than poor communities. So sometimes when these decisions are being made, like we need a new landfill, wealthier communities are able to speak out. They have the finances, they have the connections, they have the wherewithal to be able to say to their senators and representatives, not here, don't put it here, put it somewhere else. Poor communities don't always have those connections or that wherewithal. The third bullet says undesirable activities like hazardous waste landfills tend to get placed where land is cheap, right? So if you live in a community and say, hey, we need a new landfill, let's put it in the cheapest place we can. That will keep taxes low for everyone. Everybody wants low taxes, right? Where land is cheap tends to be where poor people live, and those people are sometimes of minority communities. So a lot of times I don't think this is overt racism. Sometimes it could be, I suppose, but even if it's not, still it places an unfair environmental burden on some over others, and that's our definition of environmental injustice. And these groups often have the least capacity to deal with these consequences. So really, that's a nutshell view of what is happening and has happened in the idea of environmental justice and how that has arisen in this country. There's a lot more to the story, as we will see in the upcoming couple of days, but that's a flyover of this concept. Okay, here's what I want you to do. And this really is part of this week's lab. We still do labs, but they're going to be a little bit different, as I said. I want you to play around with a little bit of data for part one of this week's lab. So the US EPA has developed a really useful and interesting online tool for monitoring environmental justice. It's called EJ Screen. And with this tool, you can create maps of demographic data and all sorts of environmental indicator data. And you can create overlays and side-by-side maps and things just to see, you know, where environmental indicators are not so good are those areas that are, you know, demographically different than other areas. So just as a quick example, I played around with it myself and I created a side-by-side map of Chicago. looking at airborne cancer risk and Black population below the poverty level, and I created this map. So on the left there, it shows air toxic cancer risk, and on the right, it shows Black population below the poverty level. So you can tell there's not a perfect overlay, right? But some areas that appear to have pretty high Black population below the poverty level are also lit up in red on the left map of having 95 to 100th percentile for airborne cancer risk. So these sort of maps can't tell you why that's happening, why the cancer risk is higher there. It just juxtaposes some data. So that's interesting. And so in some scenarios I played around with this, you really don't see much evidence at all of environmental injustice. Some you really do. So I want you to go looking at this. And so the website is epa.gov/EJ-screen, or if you just Google EJ screen, I bet you will find it. When you get to that page, launch the EJ screen tool, and then play around with it. Learn how to use it. I learned in probably about 5 or 10 minutes. They have some nice little video tutorials that you can play with, or you can just mess around with it once you launch the tool and start to make some maps and zoom in on some areas. And yeah, once you get good at it, choose an area of focus that you're interested in, and I want you to create 2 different side-by-side maps. There's a tool at the top called Add Map Side by Side that you could figure out how to use. Choose an area. Maybe it's your hometown, or maybe it's a place you're interested in, or maybe it's a city or a rural area that you are just curious about, and create some interesting environmental justice comparisons. So that means choose some demographic data on one map and choose some environmental indicator data on the side-by-side map, and just see what sort of visual comparisons you can find. Grab a screenshot of the maps that you make. Remember, I want you to make 2 of them, so it can be for the same area, but the 2 maps might show different sorts of data. And for now, just grab a screenshot or a snip and dump that into a Word document and just save it for now. We'll get back to this on Wednesday, and I'll tell you part 2 of what I want you to do with that. So really, there's 3 things I want you to do after this video, and you'll have the rest of the week to do them. So there's no rush, but you have time, right? So I want you to watch the Robert Bullard interview. I'll post that on a Word document that I will put on Notebowl Bulletin. I want you to read about Warren County, North Carolina, and then I want you to play around with EJ Screen tool and see if you can create some EJ Screen side-by-side comparison maps to see if you can find any interesting environmental justice scenarios just based on demographic data and environmental indicator data. Okay, good luck with that, and as always, let me know if you're having trouble accessing any of this, or hearing me, or seeing me, or doing anything I'm asking you to do. Last thought is that, here's a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." So you find more and more as you get into environmental problems and studying environmental problems, they become problems of social justice. And I think you've already seen that in this class quite a bit, that fairly quickly we're turning to questions of who has access and who has the burden and why isn't it fair. So with that thought, I'll leave you to play around with these things and be in touch with me if you need assistance. Otherwise, I will talk to you again on Wednesday.